Back again, casual conversational cartoon curriculum, very concise and relatively correct. As simple as possible, as soon as possible, anatomy and physiology. We're on our sixth installment right here. My apology if there's a clicking noise in this thing. I don't know where it's coming from. Anyway, last time we were together, we had talked about inflammation and phagocyte mobilization. Now let's say something about the ever amazing interferon. Just incredible stuff here. Interferon is a chemical that's produced by a virus-infected cell. So when a cell becomes infected by a virus, it may produce this chemical interferon, abbreviated IFN. Now, this chemical does not do anything particularly for the afflicted cell. Instead, the purpose of the chemical is to warn the neighboring cells that something going on. So let's say here's cell number 1, and it's been infected by a virus. Well, dang it, the thing is going to be a goner. But this thing, in essence, wants to warn neighboring cells that they got me, but don't let them get you. So interferon is produced by this virus-infected cell, and the interferon causes the neighboring cells to resist the invasion of viruses that might be released into the neighborhood. Again, the viruses spread because they get into a host cell. The host cell reproduces the viruses because it's made to do that. Then the viruses may break out and then they can infect neighboring cells. But this cell, once it's infected, may produce interferon, and the interferon will cause the neighboring cells to prevent the virus from getting in. So it's sort of like it tells them to close their doors, windows, lock everything up. And if for some reason a virus did get inside, the cell is prepared to destroy the virus once it gets inside. So the interferon is a warning from a dying cell because of a virus to the neighbors saying, don't let them get you. So here's a stupid analogy. Let's say a zombie gets inside the house right here, bites you, then dang it, you call the neighbors and say, yes, there's a zombie in my house. Yes, he bit me. Yes, they're coming after you. Yes, shoot them in the head if they show up. So just a warning to the neighboring cells right here. Interferon at one time was considered to be the next silver bullet to stop viral infections. Like antibiotics were supposed to stop bacterial infections. Unfortunately, it turns out that there's not just one kind of interferon. There are several different types. They're tissue specific. They are still being produced, however, mass-produced and given to folks to prevent viral infections from spreading more readily. This has been particularly helpful when it comes to HIV. It hasn't cured the problem, but it's prevented other viruses other than HIV to take advantage of a person's weakened immunity. Next thing right here is complement proteins. Now, complement proteins are like antibodies, but they're not as specific as antibodies. There's approximately 30 different types that are made. They're made by your liver. And just like antibodies, their main job is just to attach to something and to be a bother once they attach. So they can promote opsonization. Now, that again means that you have a cell that perhaps is difficult for a white blood cell to grab. Maybe it's got a slime layer on it. But if you put a complement protein on it, it's the equivalent of putting a handle on the thing, so it's easy for this to grab and to pull inside and perhaps get rid of. So opsonization, putting a handle on the thing so it's easier to pull inside. So tag and toe, you might say. Also, complement proteins tend to increase the inflammatory reactions. All these things right here are enhanced, so you have a better response. Also, they initiate something called a MAC attack, and that's a major complex on the surface of a cell membrane that allows it to open up like a window and for the contents of the cell to sort of spill out. It's very similar to perforins. You put a window in a cell membrane of what you're attacking, you open that window wide, and you let that cell deflate itself and pass away. More to be said about complement proteins later on, but again, they act like antibodies, except they're not as specific as antibodies. These guys are generic. Speaking of generic, down here, fever. Again, still part of your second line of defense. First off, we're talking about systemic fever, not just a hot spot like where you were bit by a mosquito, but systemic all over your body. Generally speaking, if your overall body temperature goes above 37 degrees Celsius, we'd say, okay, you got a fever. As far as how dangerous can it be? Well, a fever that gets up to 4 degrees Celsius, which is 104 degrees Fahrenheit, is now moving into the danger zone. When it gets to be 106, brain functions can stop, and 109, the person's dead. So this is referring to sustained fevers. So if your fever spikes up, then drops back down again, you won't necessarily be brain dead or die if it pops up to 109. It's sustained where that becomes problematic. At these temperatures, by the way, you literally begin to cook proteins, and so you're destroying particularly macromolecules inside your body. Any chemical that can promote a fever is called a pyrogen. Gen means create. Pyro refers to fire. Like a pyromaniac loves fire. Well, a pyrogen creates this heat, kind of a story. Here's another simple phrase right here. Again, iron and zinc are hidden in your liver and your spleen during a fever. It's a way of hoarding these two metals inside your liver and spleen and denying bacteria the opportunity of getting them. Bacteria, or many bacteria, do need those metals in order to duplicate. I think it's particularly the cell walls. Therefore, the bacteria can't reproduce as fast as they normally would. And that's one of the things that makes bacteria so dangerous as a pathogen. They reproduce so incredibly fast that it's hard for your defenses to keep up with it all. Now, what does fever do for you? Well, fever increases your rate of repair, increases your immune response, increases the amount of capillary adhesion molecules that are put out so you can find the source of the problem. It increases interferon's effect, and it slows down the pathogen's reproduction. Here are the three general phases of a fever onset. So when the fever first comes on, one of the unusual features is that you might actually feel like you're getting cold. This is due in part to the fact that at the onset of the fever, you might get vasoconstriction of blood vessels in your skin. That means less blood is going to your skin. There's less heat in your skin. Thermoreceptors in your skin report back to your brain that it's cold out there, and you might get the shivers. So in essence, you might say to yourself, you caught a cold because you got cold, you got the shivers before the fever showed up in its grand style. Well, its grand style is the stadium. That's when your fever goes up and stays up for a while. So you've got the temperature now. You don't feel like you got a chill. And then there's defervescence. Defervescence, the opposite of effervescence, refers to dropping the fever. And in defervescence, what happens is your hypothalamus sort of says, okay, we did our best raising the fever to defeat the enemy. Maybe we need to shut down. Could be momentary. You might kick back into another fever sometime soon. But when you break the fever, it's defervescence. And what happens there, in part, is vasodilation of the blood vessels inside the skin. And because of that, you get flushed with heat on your skin, and your body will sweat. So you feel like you broke the fever. You were hot, then suddenly you got flushed red, and then you sweat, and your body temperature goes down. So people talk about catching a cold, shivering here, and breaking a fever over there. Some other things that are sort of scribbled on the edge right here, some of which we've already talked about. When a cell creates a chemical that is meant to go out into the body and communicate and coordinate throughout the body, it's called endocrine. And that would be a chemical that goes into the bloodstream, goes out to your 60 or 100 trillion cells, and that's the endocrine system. However, if the target of the chemical is just neighboring cells, that chemical is called paracrine. And that's the case of interferon. The chemical was meant to tell the neighbors of what's going on. But it's also possible for a cell to make a chemical that is meant for itself, and that's called autocrine. And we'll see how T cells can produce a chemical not only to tell the neighbors, get up and get your job going, but also giving themselves a pat on the back and encouraging themselves to get up and go a little bit farther faster. A dumb analogy here is, let's say here is an athlete of some sort, and they're giving themselves a pep talk. I can do this, I'm a champion. Perhaps he wants to turn that around and tell his teammates, we can do this, we are champions. Or maybe he wants to give an interview and tell the world that my team can do this, we are champions. So it's all about how far away is the audience from the source. Some other things that show up down here, and sorry, it's pretty bad. Hopefully it's better on the computer. IL stands for chemical interleukin, I-N-T-E-R, leukin. And that literally means between the white blood cells activation. And that's where one white blood cell creates a chemical to stimulate another white blood cell. We'll see several examples of this with T cells. TNF, it's tumor necrosis factor or tissue necrosis factor. This is a chemical that's made by a white blood cell, and its main effect is to go after a tumor, to break down cells inside of a tumor. CSF, colony stimulating factor. This is where a white blood cell, in essence, sends a message back to your bone marrow, and it tells your bone marrow, there's a bone right there, that it needs backup. And so it's trying to stimulate the production of more white blood cells to get into the fight. And then here's interferon. Like we said before, it is a virus-infected cell sending a message out to the neighboring cells, telling them to put up their defenses and get ready for a possible attack by a virus. And that's the most important stuff about the second line of defense.